You call him Dad? The general's voice was low, almost unsteady, like a man who had just stepped onto ground he wasn't sure would hold him. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I nodded, confused by the fear in a four-star general's eyes. Yes, sir, I said. That's my father. The general stared at the photograph on our living room wall, the one of the young Marine in the desert, and then he slowly lowered himself into the old wooden chair, looking as though the weight of the world had just crashed down on him. That was the moment I realized something was very, very wrong. Men who wear 4 stars on their shoulders don't usually look afraid, but this one did. And his next words shattered my reality. Son, according to every military record in Washington, that man should have died 20 years ago. The truth is, until that afternoon, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my father. My dad, Frank Miller, had been driving a school bus in our little town for as long as I could remember, 20 years to be exact. It was the same yellow bus, the same winding route through the rural backroads, every single weekday. At 6:15 a.m., without fail, he would walk out the front door wearing his brown work jacket and that faded navy blue cap with the small American flag stitched on the side. He always carried the same dented thermos of black coffee, the metal dinged from years of use. I used to watch him from the front window when I was a kid, mesmerized by the routine. He'd walk down the gravel driveway, climb into the oversized driver's seat, and give 2 short taps on the horn before pulling away. That was his signature, his way of saying goodbye to the house, to the life he had built here. Folks around town liked my dad. He wasn't loud, didn't brag about his past, and certainly never sought the spotlight. He was just Frank, the guy who got your kids to school safely. Parents trusted him with their most precious cargo. Kids trusted him with their secrets. You'd hear things at the grocery store checkout line, casual remarks that painted a picture of a saint. Frank Miller's the safest bus driver in the county, they'd say. Or, that man's got the patience of a saint. He never raised his voice, never drove too fast, never missed a stop. In 20 years of navigating icy roads and unruly teenagers, he never even had a single complaint filed against him. He was invisible in the best possible way, a pillar of the community that everyone relied on but nobody truly knew. But if I'm being honest, looking back now with the clarity of hindsight, there was always one thing about my dad that didn't quite add up. It was the photograph. It hung in our living room above the old oak cabinet, a silent sentinel watching over our mundane lives. It was in a black frame that had faded slightly with age. In the picture, my father looked 20 years younger, maybe 30. He was standing with a group of Marines somewhere in a vast, sun-bleached desert. All of them were wearing desert camouflage uniforms, dusty boots, rifles slung across their shoulders. And there, right in the middle of them, was my dad, young Frank Miller. But it wasn't just the uniform that struck me, it was the look on his face. Serious, hard eyes, a jaw set in stone. He looked like a stranger. He looked like a man who had seen things that broke lesser men. Growing up, I must have asked about that photo 100 times. Dad, when was that taken? I'd prod. Long time ago, he'd say, his voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. Where were you overseas? What happened over there? And every time he'd give the same answer, delivered gently but with a steel rod running through it. Nothing worth talking about. Conversation over. The strange thing was, he never acted like someone who wanted praise. If anything, he avoided the subject with a frantic sort of energy. On Memorial Day, when the town held its small parade down Main Street, Dad never marched with the other veterans. He'd just stand quietly on the sidewalk with the rest of us, hat off, hand over his heart, watching. He wasn't bitter, he was just absent from that part of the narrative. That was my father. Quiet, ordinary, a man who woke up early, worked hard, and came home every night in time for dinner. The kind of man nobody ever wrote stories about. At least, that's what I believed until the day the black sedan pulled into our driveway. It was a cool October afternoon. The leaves had started turning red and gold, creating a fiery canopy over the street, and the wind was just strong enough to rattle the branches of the big maple tree out front. I was home visiting for the weekend, trying to reconnect with my roots. Dad was still out on his afternoon bus route, finishing his shift. Mom had passed away a few years earlier, so it was just the two of us rattling around in the old house most days. I was in the kitchen making coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, when I heard tires crunching on the gravel outside. At first, I thought it was Dad coming home early, perhaps forgetting something. But when I looked out the window, I saw something else entirely. A long black sedan, the kind you don't see much in a town like ours, sleek, government-issued, imposing. The doors opened, and out stepped a tall man in a dark military uniform. Even from the second-floor window, I could see the stars on his shoulders. 4 of them. My first thought was that he must have gotten lost. Generals don't visit bus drivers, but he walked straight up the front path like he knew exactly where he was going. He knocked on the door, 3 slow, firm knocks that echoed through the empty hallway. I remember feeling confused more than anything. What would a 4-star general want with us? When I opened the door, he looked older than I expected. Late 60s, maybe. Gray hair cut short and severe. Sharp blue eyes that seemed to notice everything at once, cataloging the peeling paint on the porch, the state of the windows, the wear on my shoes. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was calm, but carried the kind of authority you don't question, the voice of a man who has commanded thousands. "Is this the residence of Frank Miller?" "Yes, sir," I said. "That's my father." He studied my face for a second, searching for a resemblance. Then he nodded. "My name is Robert Hastings," he said. "I served with your father many years ago." That surprised me. Dad had never mentioned serving with a general. "Would it be all right if I came in?" he asked. Something about the way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like something inevitable, something that had been set in motion long ago. So I stepped aside. "Of course, sir." He walked inside slowly, his boots clicking softly on the hardwood floor. And that's when everything changed. The moment General Hastings stepped into the living room, his eyes landed on the photograph. He stopped walking completely. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him pale and drawn. For a long time, he didn't say a word. He just stared at the picture of my father and those Marines in the desert. Then his hand gripped the back of the chair beside him, his knuckles turning white, and he whispered something under his breath. Something I barely caught. "Dear God." Finally, he turned toward me. His voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. "You call him Dad?" I nodded again. "Yes, sir." He looked back at the photograph, and when he spoke next, the words made my stomach tighten into a knot. "Son," he said slowly, "according to every military record in Washington, that man should have died 20 years ago." The words sat in the air like the echo of a gunshot. That man should have died 20 years ago. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I just stared at General Hastings. Then I looked back at the photograph on the wall. My father standing in desert camouflage beside a group of Marines. The same picture I'd seen every day of my life. "How can that be?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. The general didn't answer right away. He stood slowly and walked closer to the photograph, studying it again, like someone trying to confirm something impossible. "That's him," he murmured. "No question." He turned back to me. "You said your father is out right now." "Yes, sir," I said. "He's finishing his afternoon bus route." The general nodded slowly. "Frank always did finish the job," he said quietly. The way he said my father's name made it sound like he was remembering a ghost. I poured him a cup of coffee, mostly because I needed something to do with my hands to stop them from shaking. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall, slicing the silence into jagged pieces. Neither of us spoke for a minute or two. Finally, I said the question that had been building in my mind, a burning coal in my throat. "You knew my father in the Marines." General Hastings let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. "Yes," he said, "very well." He took a sip of the coffee, his hand trembling slightly. Then he looked around the house, the worn sofa, the old carpet, the small television sitting on the corner table. It was a normal American home. Simple, comfortable, the kind of place you'd expect a retired bus driver to live. "Strange," he said softly. "What is?" I asked. "That a man like Frank Miller ended up living here." I felt a slight tightening in my chest, a defensive flare. "What's that supposed to mean?" The general sat back down. For the first time since arriving, he seemed to relax a little, though his eyes were still sharp, dissecting the room. "Your father wasn't just a Marine," he said. "He was one of the best reconnaissance officers I ever saw." That sentence alone felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. "My dad," I said, almost laughing at the absurdity. "He drove a school bus." The general gave a faint smile, a ghost of amusement. Son, life has a funny way of changing directions. He leaned forward slightly. Back in 1991, during the Gulf War, your father commanded a small reconnaissance team attached to my battalion. I listened carefully, the world narrowing down to just his voice. I had never heard my father talk about any of this. Reconnaissance teams operate ahead of the main force, the general explained. They move quietly, observe enemy positions, report back. Dangerous work, often done far behind the lines. Your father had a reputation, Hastings continued. Cool under pressure, smart, never reckless. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. In the military, that combination is rare. It saves lives. The general's eyes drifted back to the photograph. There was one mission in particular, he said, one that changed everything. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves again. The house felt very still, the air charged with electricity. What happened? I asked. The general hesitated. It was the first time he seemed unsure about telling the story. Finally, he said, a battalion of American soldiers became trapped after an unexpected Iraqi counterattack. They were cut off. No supply line, no support. He looked straight at me. About 400 men. My throat tightened. That's a lot of soldiers. It is, he said. Without help, they would have been wiped out. So, what did my father have to do with it? The general gave a small nod. Frank volunteered to lead a recon team through enemy territory to find a safe extraction route. That didn't sound like the quiet man who spent his mornings greeting school children. He took 5 men, Hastings continued. They moved 30 miles through hostile desert at night without vehicles. I tried to imagine it, my father walking through enemy territory in the dark. It felt unreal, like a movie script. The team located a gap in the Iraqi defensive line, the general said. They guided the battalion through it before sunrise. 400 men made it out alive. I leaned back in the chair, stunned. The sheer magnitude of it was suffocating. You're saying my dad saved them? The general nodded slowly. Yes. Then his face darkened slightly, shadows passing over his features. But the mission didn't end the way it should have. What do you mean? Hastings stared down into his coffee cup, swirling the dark liquid. When Frank's team returned to friendly lines, something went wrong. What kind of wrong? A firefight. The word landed heavily in the quiet kitchen. 2 members of his team were killed, and the official report blamed Frank. I frowned, anger flaring instantly. Why? The general looked up at me again, his eyes sad. Because someone needed to take the blame. Those words made my stomach twist. That doesn't make any sense. War rarely does, he said quietly. The investigation concluded that Captain Frank Miller had disobeyed orders. The title sounded strange coming from someone talking about my dad, Captain. Because of that report, Hastings continued, his military career ended overnight. Court-martial, I asked, fearing the answer. No, the general shook his head. Something quieter. What does that mean? It means, he said slowly, choosing his words with care, that his record disappeared. That sentence made the room feel colder. Disappeared. Classified, sealed, buried under paperwork. Officially, Captain Frank Miller was listed as killed in action during the operation. I stared at him, the pieces not fitting together. But he wasn't. No, the general said. He survived. Then why would they say he died? The general didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at the photograph again. Because it was easier than explaining what really happened. Before I could ask another question, I heard something outside. The sound of gravel crunching. A familiar sound. A yellow school bus engine. Dad. I stood and looked out the window. The bus rolled slowly into the driveway just like it had every afternoon for 20 years. Same routine, same steady driver behind the wheel, except now everything felt different. The yellow paint looked brighter, the contrast sharper. Behind me, General Hastings stood up. I heard the quiet rustle of his uniform as he adjusted his collar. He looked toward the front door. After all these years, he said softly, I never thought I'd see him again. The bus engine shut off. The door opened with its usual pneumatic hiss. Dad stepped down onto the driveway. He closed the bus door, turned, and started walking toward the house. From the window, he looked exactly the same as always. Brown jacket, old cap, lunch bag in one hand. But now I knew something I hadn't known an hour earlier. The quiet bus driver walking up our driveway was once a man the military believed was dead. He was a ghost story walking into his own kitchen. Dad opened the front door and stepped inside. He saw me first, then his eyes moved to the man standing in the living room. For the first time in my life, I saw my father freeze. The easy, relaxed posture vanished, replaced by a coiled tension I had never witnessed. The two men stared at each other, 20 years of history hanging silently between them. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice calm but guarded. "Robert Hastings," he said, "you took your time finding me." The general's reply was almost a whisper. "Frank," he said, "we need to talk." Dad set his lunch bag down on the kitchen counter with the same care he used for everything else in life. No sudden movements, no raised voice. If a stranger had walked in at that moment, he might have thought nothing unusual was happening. Two older men standing in a modest living room looking at each other across a lifetime. But I knew better. There was a stiffness in my father's shoulders I had never seen before, and there was something in General Hastings's expression that looked a lot like regret. Dad took off his cap and laid it beside the lunch bag. Then he looked at me. "You put coffee on?" he asked. It was such a normal question that for half a second I almost laughed. "Yes," I said. "There's some left." He nodded once, then he turned back to the general. "You'd better sit down, Robert," he said. "You look older than I remember." The general gave a tired little smile. "So do you." Dad poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table like this was just another ordinary evening. The October light slanted through the curtains, catching the steam from his cup. He wrapped both hands around it before taking a sip. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The tension was palpable, a physical weight in the air. Finally, I said what had been burning inside me since Hastings arrived. "Dad, is it true?" He looked at me carefully. "What part?" "That you were a Marine captain. That they said you died. That something happened over there and your record was buried." He was quiet a long time. Then he let out a breath through his nose and looked down at the table. "I suppose if Robert's here, there's not much point pretending anymore." The general leaned forward slightly. "Frank, he deserves to know." Dad gave him a flat look. "You think I don't know that?" Then he turned back to me. "Yes," he said. "I was a Marine officer." Even hearing him say it felt strange. It was like hearing your pastor admit he used to be a prize fighter. "I served with a reconnaissance unit during Desert Storm. Captain at the time. Before that, years of training, field exercises, enough sand and dust to last 3 lifetimes. He said it plainly without pride. "I didn't tell you, because I didn't want that part of my life, becoming the center of this family." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Then what happened?" Dad stared into his coffee. "A bad mission," he said. General Hastings shifted. "It was more than that." Dad's eyes lifted to his. "I know exactly what it was." The room went quiet again. Then Dad began. "We were attached to Robert's battalion. Recon means you move ahead of everybody else. You see what they can't see yet. Sometimes you come back, sometimes you don't." He took another sip, then set the mug down. "The mission Robert told you about, the one where we found an escape route for those trapped men. That part is true. We got them out. Not because I was a hero, because the men with me were good at their jobs." He said that the way decent men often do, pushing credit away from themselves. "There were 6 of us. We moved at night, kept low, stayed off the radios unless we had to. We found a route through a weak spot in the enemy line. We marked it, sent it back, and guided the battalion through before first light." He looked at his hands, turning them over as if checking for invisible stains. 400 men walked out alive." The words landed softly, but they changed the shape of the room. I tried to picture him doing that. My father, who helped old ladies load groceries into their cars and remembered every child's birthday on his route, leading a team through enemy lines. "And then?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Then we were told to hold position until transport reached us." He paused. "That order changed." General Hastings lowered his gaze. He already knew this part. Dad continued. "A colonel, one of the planners attached to command, sent a revised directive. We were to push farther east and confirm a suspected artillery position. Was it a real order? I asked. Dad gave a humorless little smile. That depends on who you ask. He explained that the message came through fast and late without the normal confirmation chain he trusted. But in war, delays get people killed, too. If the artillery position was real, American troops were still in danger. So, you followed it? I said. I did, he said it without apology. We moved out before dawn and we walked into a setup. The wind tapped a loose branch against the side of the house. No artillery battery, he said. No clear objective, just bad intelligence, bad timing, and enemy fire coming from more directions than it should have. He swallowed once. We got hit hard. The general spoke quietly. Frank lost 2 men. Dad didn't look at him. I remember every one of them. He named them then slowly, as if laying stones in a line. Danny Ruiz, Caleb Turner. He let the names hang in the room. Ruiz was 23. Turner had a baby girl back home he hadn't met yet. I didn't know what to say. There are moments when words feel cheap, and that was one of them. Dad's eyes remained fixed on the table. We fought our way out with the rest, came back bruised, exhausted, half blind with sand and smoke. I figured there'd be questions. I expected an investigation. He looked up at me. I did not expect them to decide the answer before they asked the questions. I felt anger rising in me now, hot and clean. They blamed you. Yes. For what? Disobeying orders, acting without authorization, compromising the mission. But you had orders. I had a message, he said. That's not always the same thing. General Hastings finally spoke. Frank raised concerns immediately. He said the order chain looked wrong. He said the intelligence didn't fit, but by then command was already protecting itself. Dad gave a short nod. There was a colonel involved. Good family, polished record, friends in all the right offices. He was 1 promotion away from a general star. A failed operation tied to his planning would have finished him. So they sacrificed you, I said, the bitterness thick in my mouth. Dad looked at me steadily. They sacrificed the truth. That was somehow worse. I pushed back from the table and stood up, too restless to sit. You just let them do it. The second the words left my mouth, I regretted the edge in them. Dad didn't flinch. Yes, he said. That only made me angrier. How could you let them say you were dead? How could you come home and act like none of it happened? His face softened, but only a little. Because I was tired, he said. Because your mother was pregnant. Because 2 men were dead and I was the one who had to write letters to their families. Because I had already seen what institutions do when they decide a story matters more than the truth. He leaned back in his chair. And because sometimes surviving is the only fight you have left. That shut me up. The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then stopped. After a while, Dad went on. They offered me a quiet exit. No prison, no public court-martial, no newspapers. Just papers signed in back rooms, records sealed, and a fresh start somewhere else. You took it, I asked. He nodded. I took your mother and moved. We came here, found this little house. I got licensed, learned the routes, started driving a school bus. The first morning, I picked up a little girl with 2 missing front teeth and a lunchbox bigger than her head. I remember thinking, maybe this is enough. His voice had changed by then, not broken, just tired in an old, deep way. Enough for what? I asked. For a life, he said. General Hastings spoke again carefully. Frank, I didn't come here to reopen wounds for the sake of it. Dad looked at him. Then why are you here? The general reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and removed a thick manila envelope. He placed it on the table between them. Because for the first time in 20 years, he said, I have proof the order was falsified. Dad's face didn't change much, but I saw his fingers tighten around the coffee cup. The general slid the envelope toward him. The colonel who set you up left a trail. It was buried, but not well enough. A staff attorney found discrepancies during a records review. Wrong timestamps, altered routing, missing confirmations. I stared at the envelope as though it might start burning through the table. So, that's it, I said. He can be exposed. General Hastings looked at me. He can. Then he looked at my father. But if we do this, the whole cover-up comes back into the light. Dad rested one hand on the envelope, but didn't open it. I buried that life for a reason, he said. And I came to unbury it for one, Hastings replied. Dad said nothing. He just sat there, a school bus driver in a modest kitchen with 20 years of silence under one hand and the truth under the other. Then he looked at me, and in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he said, "You may not like what comes next." The envelope sat on the kitchen table like something alive. For a long moment, no one touched it. Dad kept his hand resting lightly on top of it, almost the way someone rests a hand on an old scar, aware of it but not ready to press too hard. General Hastings waited quietly. I stood near the counter, my arms folded, watching the two of them. Finally, Dad slid the envelope back across the table. "I'm not opening that," he said. The general didn't look surprised. "I figured you might say that." Dad leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window where the school bus sat in the driveway. "You remember something about me, Robert?" he said calmly. "I don't go looking for trouble." The general nodded slowly. "I remember." "Then you remember something else," Dad added. "Once I make a decision, I don't revisit it." Hastings sighed softly. "Frank, this isn't just about you." Dad turned his head slightly. "It never was." The general leaned forward. "That Colonel Arthur Caldwell, he's about to retire. 40 years of service, decorations, speeches, a spotless record." Dad didn't respond. "But that record was built on a lie," Hastings continued. "Your lie." I felt anger rise in my chest again. "So, he gets to walk away clean," I said. Dad looked at me. "Sit down," he said gently. I did. "You're angry," he said. "Yes," I admitted. He nodded. "That's natural." He paused. "But you're not angry?" I asked. Dad thought about that. "Oh, I was," he said quietly. "When it first happened." He leaned back and rubbed his hands together slowly like he was remembering a long winter. "For a while I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the desert again, saw Ruiz and Turner lying there, heard the radio crackle with that order that never should have existed." He paused. "I wanted someone to pay." "What changed?" I asked. "You were born," he said simply. That answer stopped me. Dad looked at the general. "When I held my son for the first time, I realized something." "What's that?" Hastings asked. "That revenge is a heavy thing to carry into a new life." He gave a small shrug. "So, I set it down." The general studied him carefully. "You set it down," he said, "but it never went away." Dad didn't argue. The truth was sitting right there on the table. I leaned forward. "What's in the envelope?" I asked. General Hastings answered. "Evidence." "What kind?" The colonel's staff altered the communications log that night. The original order routing was changed after the fact. He tapped the envelope. "The real-time stamps are inside." I felt my pulse quicken. That proves Dad didn't disobey orders. "Yes, and it proves the colonel knew it." "Yes." I looked at my father. "Then why wouldn't you want that out?" Dad met my eyes calmly. "Because there's a cost." "What cost?" "The Army doesn't like digging up old mistakes," he said, "especially when they involve senior officers." Hastings nodded. "He's right." Dad continued. "If this investigation starts, they won't just question Caldwell, they'll question everyone involved." He pointed gently toward himself. "Which means they'll question me, too." "That's good," I said. "You'll be cleared." Dad shook his head. "It's not that simple." He folded his hands. "There are men still serving who were junior officers back then. Good men. They followed orders, signed reports, did what the system expected." He looked at the envelope again. "If this comes out, some of them could lose their careers." That thought hadn't crossed my mind. General Hastings spoke. "Frank, those men deserve the truth, too." Dad considered that. "Maybe." Then he looked at me. "But here's the question you should ask yourself." "What?" "What kind of justice are you looking for?" I opened my mouth, but hesitated. Dad continued. "Justice that fixes the past or justice that destroys the present." Neither option felt easy. The kitchen clock ticked again. Finally, the general spoke. I didn't come here expecting you to decide tonight. Dad nodded. Good, because I already have. He pushed the envelope back toward Hastings. Take it. The general frowned. You're sure? Yes. You're willing to let Caldwell retire with his reputation intact. Dad stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the school bus sitting quietly in the driveway. You see that bus? He asked. The general turned slightly. Yes. I've driven that route for 20 years, Dad said. 3 generations of kids. He smiled faintly. Some of the parents now rode my bus when they were little. He looked back at us. I've helped lost first graders find their backpacks, sat with kids who were crying because their parents were divorcing, waited extra minutes on snowy mornings so nobody had to walk too far. His voice softened. That life means something to me. I could see that, the calm routine, the quiet purpose. Dad continued. If reopening this case means dragging that life into courtrooms and headlines, then no. He turned to the general. I'm not interested. General Hastings rubbed his jaw slowly. I was afraid you might say that. I felt a knot of frustration tighten in my chest. So that's it, I said. That man gets away with it. Dad looked at me carefully. Son, life isn't always about getting even. But it should be about the truth. Yes, Dad agreed, but sometimes the truth takes its own path. General Hastings stood up. Well, he said quietly, whether you want it or not, the truth is already moving. Dad's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? The general hesitated. Because once I found the evidence, I couldn't keep it to myself. The room went still. You started something, Dad said. I did. How far has it gone? Hastings exhaled slowly. Far enough that the Department of Defense has opened a quiet review. My heart skipped. A review? Yes. Dad looked at him for several seconds. You should have told me before you came. I wanted to, Hastings said, but I also wanted to see you first. Why? Because if this becomes public, your life will change whether you want it to or not. Dad stood silently. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose branch against the siding again. After a long moment, Dad spoke. You always were stubborn, Robert. The general smiled faintly. And you always were the best man I ever served with. Dad didn't reply to that. Instead, he walked back to the table and picked up the envelope. For a moment, he held it in both hands. Then he opened it. He pulled out the first sheet of paper and read quietly. I watched his face. At first, nothing changed. Then slowly, something shifted. Not anger, something deeper, recognition. Finally, he placed the papers back inside the envelope. Well, he said softly, looks like the past finally caught up with us. He looked at me. You wanted answers, he said. You're about to get more than you expected. Dad didn't say much after he opened the envelope. He just stood there in the kitchen for a while, the papers resting loosely in his hands, the afternoon light stretching across the table. Finally, he folded the documents back into the envelope and placed it down again. Looks real, he said quietly. General Hastings nodded. It is. Dad exhaled slowly and walked over to the sink. He rinsed his coffee cup even though there was still some left inside. That was another thing about my father. When something weighed on his mind, he cleaned things. The sink, the counter, the bus, anything that gave his hands something to do. I leaned against the doorway. So what happens now? I asked. Dad dried the cup with a dish towel before answering. Now, he said. Now we go to bed. Tomorrow morning I drive the bus. I stared at him. That's it. He turned and looked at me, calm as ever. That's enough for tonight. But it wasn't enough for me. The truth had cracked open something inside my chest, and I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. You really mean to ignore this? I said, pointing to the envelope. Dad walked back to the table and sat down. I mean to think about it. General Hastings shifted in his chair. You won't have long, he said. Dad raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The review board meets in Washington next week. Dad frowned slightly. That soon? Yes, the general clasped his hands together. Once they verify the communication logs, they'll reopen the mission report. And Caldwell, Dad asked. He'll be questioned. Dad leaned back. That man's been sitting comfortably for 20 years. Which is exactly why the truth matters now, Hastings replied. Dad didn't argue, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. After a while, the general stood. I should head back to the hotel, he said. Dad nodded politely. I'll walk you out. The two men stepped onto the front porch together. I stayed inside but watched through the window. The evening sun had dipped low, painting the sky orange above the rows of houses on our street. General Hastings stood beside the black sedan, his cap tucked under one arm. Dad listened while he spoke. I couldn't hear what they said, but I could tell it was serious. At one point, the general placed a hand on my father's shoulder. Dad didn't move. Finally, they shook hands. The general got into the car and drove away, the gravel crunching under the tires until the sound faded down the road. Dad stayed on the porch for several minutes after that. When he came back inside, the house felt quieter than before. He closed the door gently and walked into the living room. His eyes went straight to the photograph, the one of him and the Marines in the desert. He stood there a long time. You never told me any of that, I said. He didn't turn around. I didn't want to. Why? Because that life was over. He finally looked at me, and I didn't want it following you around. I understood that part, but something still gnawed at me. Dad, those men you mentioned, Ruiz and Turner. He nodded. They died because of that false order. Yes, and the man responsible just went on with his career. Dad didn't answer. I stepped closer. Doesn't that bother you? His expression softened, but it didn't change much. It did once, and now I focus on the men who lived. That answer was so simple it almost hurt. But don't you want your name cleared? He thought about it. I've had a good life. That's not what I asked. He smiled faintly. You're stubborn. You're avoiding the question. He sat down on the sofa and gestured for me to sit across from him. Listen, he said. Justice isn't always what people think it is. I folded my arms. Explain. He leaned forward slightly. If the truth comes out now, Caldwell's reputation collapses. The army admits a cover-up. News reporters start digging through old files. Lawyers get involved. He paused. And suddenly, the story stops being about the men we saved. What does it become about? I asked. Scandal. I hadn't thought about it like that. Dad continued. The battalion we got out of there, 400 soldiers. Most of them went on to live full lives. He gestured toward the photograph. That's the story I want remembered. Not the politics, not the blame, just the lives that were saved. I sat quietly, letting that settle in. But something inside me still resisted. Maybe the truth deserves to be told anyway, I said. Dad nodded slowly. Maybe it does. He stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the school bus sat where he had parked it earlier. The fading sunlight glowed off the yellow paint. I've spent 20 years driving that bus, he said. Every morning those kids climb aboard, trusting that I'll get them where they're going. He turned back toward me. That's the job I care about now. I watched him carefully. You're afraid this investigation will take that away. He didn't answer directly, but I could tell I was close to the truth. The room went quiet again. Then Dad did something unexpected. He picked up the envelope. Tomorrow, he said, I'm calling the review board. My eyes widened. You are? Yes. What changed? He looked at me. You did. Me. You asked the right question. What question? He gave a small smile. Whether the truth deserves to be told. He tapped the envelope gently, and the answer is yes. For the first time since General Hastings had arrived, I saw something new in my father's eyes. Not anger, not regret, determination. Looks like we've got work to do, he said. And for the first time in 20 years, the quiet bus driver was stepping back into a fight he thought he had left behind. The next few weeks moved slowly, but the weight of them was different. Not heavy in the old way, heavy in the way a storm feels when you can see it building on the horizon. Dad still drove the school bus every morning. Nothing about that changed. At 6:15 sharp, he walked out the front door with his thermos. The same jacket, the same cap, the same quiet routine. But now I knew what he was carrying under that calm surface. And apparently so did Washington. 3 days after Dad called the review board, a letter arrived. Official Department of Defense letterhead. Inside was a formal request. Captain Frank Miller was to appear before a military review panel regarding the mission report from Operation Desert Shield. I watched Dad read it at the kitchen table. He didn't look surprised, just thoughtful. "Well," he said finally, "looks like they're serious." "You're really going to go?" I asked. He folded the letter carefully. "Yes." "Why?" He gave the same simple answer he'd given before. "Because the truth deserves its day." The hearing was scheduled for the following month in Washington, D.C. Until then, the review board began gathering statements. That's when something unexpected happened. The men from Dad's old unit started calling. At first, it was just one. A voice on the phone that Dad hadn't heard in decades. I was sitting in the living room when the call came. Dad picked up the phone. "Frank Miller." There was a pause, then Dad's face changed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "Sergeant Collins." He leaned back in the chair and listened. "Yes, yes," I heard. Another pause, then Dad glanced toward me. "Of course, I remember. You still owe me $20 from that poker game." I could hear laughter on the other end of the line. When the call ended, Dad sat quietly for a moment. "What did he say?" I asked. "He heard about the review," Dad replied, "and he wants to testify." That was the first of many calls. Over the next week, more veterans reached out, men who had served in the battalion Dad helped save. Some had moved across the country. Some had retired. Some had built entire lives since the war, but they all remembered that night. One afternoon, Dad put the phone on speaker so I could listen. The voice on the line was older, gravelly. "This is Lieutenant Mark Daniels." Dad smiled slightly. "Mark, you made it." "Because of you," Daniels replied. I could hear emotion in the man's voice. "Frank, when we heard they were finally reopening the case," he paused. "I told my wife I'd been waiting 30 years for that phone call." Dad shifted in his chair. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "That's where you're wrong," Daniels replied. "You pulled 400 men out of a death trap." Another voice joined the call briefly, Daniels' wife. "Tell him thank you," she said. Dad didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded slowly even though she couldn't see him. After the call ended, he stared at the phone for a long time. "I didn't expect this," he said. "What?" "People remembering." Word spread quietly among the veterans. Within 2 weeks, the review board had received written statements from more than 30 soldiers, each one telling the same story. Captain Frank Miller didn't cause the disaster. He saved them. General Hastings visited again one evening. This time he looked less tense. "They're taking the testimony seriously," he said. "That's good," Dad replied. Hastings leaned forward. "You should know something else." "What?" "The colonel," Dad's eyes narrowed slightly. "Caldwell." "Yes, what about him?" "He's been notified." The room went quiet, and, I asked. "He denied everything." Dad didn't seem surprised. "That sounds like Arthur." Hastings continued, "But the evidence is stronger than he expected." "What kind of evidence?" I asked. The general opened a folder. An old communications technician came forward. Dad raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Staff Sergeant Lewis." Dad blinked. "Lewis, you remember him?" Dad nodded slowly. "Kid who ran the signal equipment." "Exactly." Hastings smiled faintly. "Well, that kid is now a retired telecommunications engineer, and he kept copies." Dad leaned forward. "Copies of what?" "The original transmission logs." The words hung in the air. "Logs that prove the colonel's staff altered the order after your team returned." Dad sat back quietly. For the first time since this process started, I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, not satisfaction, something like closure beginning to form. "When's the hearing?" he asked. 3 weeks, Hastings replied. Dad nodded once. "Then we'd better be ready." The weeks passed quickly after that. I traveled with Dad to Washington. It was the first time I'd ever seen him nervous. Not outwardly, but small things gave it away. The way he straightened his jacket 3 times before leaving the hotel. The way he checked the folder of documents again and again. The hearing took place in a quiet government building near the Pentagon. No cameras, no reporters, just a long table, several officers, and the weight of 30 years of silence. When Dad walked into that room, the officers stood, not because they had to, but because they recognized him. General Hastings sat at the far end. He gave a small nod. Dad returned it. Then he took his seat. The senior officer cleared his throat. "Captain Miller," he said, "it's been a long time." Dad answered calmly. "Yes, sir. We appreciate your willingness to revisit this matter." Dad folded his hands. "The truth is worth revisiting." The hearing lasted hours. Witnesses spoke. Documents were reviewed. The communications logs were presented. By the time it ended, the room felt different, quieter, heavier. The senior officer finally spoke. "Based on the evidence presented, the board finds that Captain Frank Miller did not disobey orders." My chest tightened. Dad didn't move. "The board further finds that the mission report was altered following the operation." He paused. "Responsibility for that alteration rests with Colonel Arthur Caldwell." Silence filled the room. 30 years of silence finally broken. The officer closed the folder in front of him. "Captain Miller," he said, "your record will be corrected immediately." Dad nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir." But the officer wasn't finished. "There is one more matter." Dad looked up. "Due to your actions during that operation, the board will recommend that you be awarded the Silver Star." For a moment, Dad just stared at him. Then he gave a small shake of his head. "That won't be necessary." The officer smiled slightly. "I'm afraid that decision is no longer yours." And for the first time in 30 years, justice had finally caught up with the truth. The ceremony took place 3 months later. It wasn't the kind of loud military event you sometimes see on television. No giant stage, no television cameras, just a modest hall on a nearby base, rows of folding chairs, and a quiet gathering of soldiers, veterans, and a few civilians. Dad almost didn't go. Even after the review board corrected his record, even after the recommendation for the Silver Star became official, he tried to refuse it twice. "I didn't do anything special," he told them. But the Army didn't accept that answer. General Hastings explained it to him over the phone one evening. "Frank," he said, "sometimes the medal isn't just for the man who earned it." Dad frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's also for the truth that got buried." That seemed to settle it, so we drove out to the base early that morning. Dad wore a borrowed suit. The only tie he owned was an old Navy one my mother had given him years ago. When we walked into the hall, I noticed something immediately. A lot of the men there were watching him, not with curiosity, but with recognition. Some of them stood as he passed. One older veteran walked straight up and shook his hand. "Sir," the man said quietly. Dad looked embarrassed. "Please don't call me that." But the respect in the room was unmistakable. General Hastings was already there speaking with several officers near the stage. When he saw us, he smiled and came over. "You clean up well, Frank," he said. Dad glanced down at the suit jacket. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's clothes." "That's because you spent the last 20 years dressed like a bus driver," Hastings replied with a grin. Dad chuckled softly. Then the general looked at me. "You must be proud of your father." I nodded. "I am." Ceremony began shortly afterward. A colonel stepped to the podium and spoke about the Gulf War, about the chaos of combat and the bravery of soldiers who often did their work without recognition. Then he began telling the story, not just the official version, but the real one. He spoke about a reconnaissance team that had slipped through enemy lines to find a safe path for a trapped battalion, about the lives that had been saved, about the years of silence that followed, and finally, he said my father's name. Captain Frank Miller. Dad walked to the front of the room slowly, not stiffly like a soldier on parade, just the way he walked everywhere else, calm, steady. The colonel pinned the medal to his jacket. The Silver Star gleamed under the lights. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then the applause started. Not loud, but long. Dad looked uncomfortable standing there. He waited for the room to quiet before speaking. "I appreciate the honor," he said. His voice was calm, just like it always was. "But I'd like to say something." The colonel stepped aside. Dad looked out across the room. Some of the faces he recognized, others were strangers. 30 years ago," he said, 6 men walked into the desert together." He paused. 4 of us walked out. The room grew still again. 2 of those men never got the chance to grow old, he continued. Danny Ruiz and Caleb Turner. He said their names slowly, clearly, ensuring they echoed in the hall. "I carried those names with me every day after that." He glanced down at the medal. "If this belongs to anyone, it belongs to them." No one spoke. Dad looked back at the audience. "I also want to say something else." He took a breath. "For the past 20 years, I've driven a school bus in a small town." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. "And I can tell you something about that job," he continued. "It's one of the most important jobs I've ever had." The audience listened closely. "Every morning, those kids climb aboard, trusting that someone will get them safely where they need to go." He smiled faintly. "That responsibility means more to me than any medal." The room remained silent for a moment. Then the applause returned, even stronger this time. After the ceremony, people came over to speak with him. Veterans, officers, some of the soldiers from that battalion. One man in his 60s shook Dad's hand with both of his. "You saved my life," he said. Dad shook his head gently. "You saved your own," he replied. But the man didn't let go of his hand right away. "Still," he said quietly, "thank you." Later that afternoon, we drove home. The sun was low in the sky by the time we reached town. The streets looked exactly the same as they always had. Same grocery store, same diner, same row of houses with American flags on their porches. Dad pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, he just sat there. Then he took the medal from his pocket and looked at it. "You know something," he said. "What?" I asked. "I think your mother would have laughed at this." "Why?" "Because she always said, I had a way of making simple things complicated." I smiled. That sounds like her. Dad stepped out of the truck. Inside the house, he walked straight to the living room wall. The photograph was still there. The younger version of him standing beside those Marines in the desert. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set the medal down on the shelf beneath the frame. Not in the center, just off to the side, like it belonged there, but didn't need to be the focus. The next morning, something happened that made me realize just how much my father had changed and how much he hadn't. At 6:15 sharp, he picked up his thermos, put on the same old jacket, the same cap, and walked out to the school bus. I stood at the window watching him like I had when I was a kid. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away. No speech, no celebration, just the quiet continuation of a life he had chosen long ago. Later that afternoon, when he came home, I asked him a question. "Do you feel different now?" I said, "now that everything's cleared up?" Dad thought about it, then he smiled. "A little." "How?" "Well," he said, "it's nice knowing the truth finally caught up." He paused. "But the important part is what comes after." "And what's that?" He gestured toward the window where the empty road stretched through town. "Living the life you built." That night, we sat on the porch together, watching the sun go down. The sky turned the same deep orange it had the day the general first arrived. After a while, Dad spoke again. "You know," he said, "a lot of people spend their lives chasing recognition." He looked at the quiet street. "But the real reward is knowing you did the right thing even when nobody was watching." He turned toward me. "And if this story meant something to you, maybe it'll mean something to someone else, too." He smiled gently. "So, if it did, pass it along. Share it with someone who might need the reminder. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this.